but let's be sure that it's okay. You are live.
Preparing
and
to
now,
live stream the meeting. Yeah.
Good. And now let's go to the YouTube again, because we need the link. We need to find this link.
Okay. It's now going.
Important, on the YouTube account, switch off the sound. Because we need the link. We need to find this link. Because what you hear now is the YouTube sound, so you have to switch off that sound. Important, on the YouTube account, switch off the sound.
How do I do that?
Go on the YouTube live stream. The YouTube sound, so you have to switch off that sound. Important, on the YouTube account, switch off the sound.
How do I switch off this sound?
I'm writing down on the chat.
How do I switch off this sound?
I'm writing down on the chat.
Okay. Okay.
You have to see the movie going on in the YouTube.
I do, but
window.
I don't see where it says to turn off the sound.
Left-hand side.
Left-hand side?
Where you have play, next to play, you have the...
Oh, I see. I do. There we go.
Wonderful. Great.
Sorry.
Now make me co-host, please, now, if you can. And then
you want to be co-host.
And then let's start admitting people, because I suspect you have already a number of people waiting. Sorry for all this, but we are live
It's
on
okay.
YouTube.
I think, Donna, you're host. So you can you will have to make me host.
No, I did give you back the host. That's why you could broadcast it.
Oh. So I'm now the host. You want me to make you the host now?
No, just co-host so that we can.
Oops. I just muted you by mistake.
So don't make me host, just make me co-host. Because now you have to be host in order to broadcast things.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out. Okay.
You click on my icon right hand side, and then there is a make co-host.
Okay, make co-host. There we go.
Okay.
So is everything okay now?
Everything is all right, but the question is, okay, we have to admit people. I'm admitting them.
Okay. How about just admit all?
Okay.
I was getting worried. Hello.
Hello, apologize for being a bit late. We were struggling to broadcast. So now, guys, we are broadcast on YouTube. So we are live on YouTube, just in case. And I'm going to send you the link in a minute. Hello, everyone. Good to see
Hello.
you.
Without Claudia, we're in trouble, but we managed. Claudia is on an airplane on her way back to Princeton from Romania. So she couldn't be here for all of the technical stuff that she always does.
So it took us a bit of time to figure out what to do.
Yes.
But we did, and now we are live on YouTube. And then there is another thing we need from you, the link to the YouTube movie.
How do I get that?
Go back to the, I assume that the YouTube is playing as
Yes.
a window. Go on that window and go up at where the links are, copy that link and paste it here in the chat. Yes, so that we all have it, and I'm distributing
Okay.
it on Facebook.
Just a moment. To you personally or to everybody?
To everybody, so that we can distribute the link to whoever wants to see it, put it on Facebook.
There.
Wonderful. So for everyone, there is a link that you can, if you want, distribute further on Facebook. Which I'm going to do.
I'll admit everybody who's in the waiting room.
Wonderful. Right, so we can begin by saying that what better introduction to a discussion on experimental philosophy and the philosophy of experiment than what we did together with Dan in the previous 10 minutes, and everyone can listen on the YouTube. Namely, we experimented how to transfer hosts and co-hosts and how to be live on YouTube. Right, so welcome everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on which meridian you are. Our Princeton-Bucharest session tonight is called Robert Boyle, Philosophy and Experiment. And our three speakers are Marina Banchetti, Michele DiMeo, and William Eaton. And of course, in the heat of the moment and the experiment, in the heat of the experiment, I forgot to ask who is first.
I'd like to go first because I deal with kind of an earlier period in Boyle's philosophy.
Good, wonderful. Then Bill, you are first. Who will be second?
I'm dealing with the 1680s, so I'm at the end of his life. I'm not sure about the other paper.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was kicked out of Zoom.
I'm sorry. So Marina, would you like to go second, and Michele will go the third?
Sure.
Is that good? Okay, then this is how we are going to proceed. And our first talk by William Eaton is called Fish Function and Philosophy, the Petty Boyle Dissections. Bill, the floor is yours.
All right, let me try and share the screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right, so I'm not going to have time to say everything I want to say, but I can at least give you basically what some of the research I've been working on and the topics I'm interested in and some of the conclusions I've drawn. But yeah, it's called Fish Function and Philosophy, the Petty Boyle Dissections. And so I'm going to start first with just saying just a couple of words briefly about what my general philosophical project is. And then I'll get more to the specific point of these dissections. So yeah, my general project is what's called the Needham question. after Joseph Needham and his epic work, Science and Civilization in China. Basically, the Needham question is if most, not just many, but most of the achievements we associate with the scientific revolution occurred first in China, why did the scientific revolution occur in Europe? And just a few examples of what I'm talking about. Most famously, the what I call the Baconian three, the three technological innovations that Bacon himself recognized as leading to the modern world. All three came from China. So the compass, gunpowder, and printing. And with printing, you have to mention the invention of paper, which is very significant as well. But the list goes on and on if you're willing to look into it. Even obscure things like the intertranslatability between algebra and geometry, which I always personally attributed to Descartes. That happened first in China. And what we'll talk a lot about today is the circulation of the blood. As you know, even when I was in school, it was being taught as a discovery by William Harvey. But it was common medical knowledge in China for that 2,000 years. And if you look at the Yellow Emperor's guide to corporeal medicine, not just the circulation of the blood, but you even find mechanical analogies there. So if all these kind of incredible innovations we associate with the scientific revolution occurred in China, why did it happen in Europe? And so my view on it, I got to be honest, it's unoriginal, it's speculative, and it's a little bit naive. One reviewer called it Whiggish, but I've identified at least two relevant differences. One is what I like to call the first commandment of punk rock, to question authority. There's in Europe, there's this capacity to question authority, and you see it. Well, I see it first in who I consider the first early modern empiricist, Vesalius. He's able to challenge the authority of Galen. It's not socially accepted. In a couple of his lectures early on, when he hints that Galen's anatomy is mistaken, people walk out of his lecture. So it's not socially acceptable to question authority. He has to go out at night and steal corpses to do his experiments. But there's a capacity to question authority. So that's one thing. And then the thing I'm really going to talk about today, and then I'll get to the specifics, is what I think of as the effectiveness of empirical observation to decide between competing structural explanations. And in today's context, structural explanation is going to be pretty much limited to the mechanical philosophy of the 17th century. And the relationship between mechanical explanations and structural explanations, we can get into that if you want, but I'm all for it doesn't matter to me. But yeah, so my specific, that's my general sort of project in philosophy of science. But my specific topic today is this kind of an obscure event that occurred early on in the development of Boyle's scientific method. And it's obscure not in the sense that nobody knows about it. Everybody knows about it, and they recognize it, but I think they don't give it due credit. You get one or two lines about it and they move on as if Boyle was only in Ireland for 2 weeks, but he was there 2 years. So just some background on what he's doing there. After his father died and his grand tour of Europe was over, Boyle settled at one of the many estates, this one at Stalbridge, and devoted himself to writing these chivalric romances, which are pretty dreadful, really. But under the influence of his older sister, the good lady Catherine Ranelagh, he becomes acquainted with the high-lived circle, and he starts to see how he can combine he already had a little bit of an interest in natural philosophy, but his sister shows him how he can combine that with this kind of religious quest he's on. His sort of religious goals can be combined with natural philosophy. And so he gets the scientific bug. Now, this is controversial. Hunter says as late as 1649. I think it's much earlier, 1646, and Dr. DiMeo will maybe back me up on that. There's a famous letter to his sister where he laments this furnace that arrives broken. So I think he's trying to learn chemistry. He's trying to get a chemical laboratory established there at Stallbridge, but he's unsuccessful. So a lot of his work, he's doing some chemistry, the sort of thing you can do in your kitchen, which is more extensive than you think, but the sort of high-tech stuff he needs to do, he needs professional equipment to do that, and he's thwarted. So he's doing a lot of theoretical work in chemistry and anatomy, by the way. Mainly through correspondences with George Starkey. Sorry, I'm rushing through this. I'm just trying to get the setup. George Starkey, the American alchemist, is basically teaching him Helmontian chemistry, but it's pretty theoretical. But what he wants to do is learn more chemistry and start doing hands-on chemistry. And he's called away to Ireland to settle matters of his estates. And he's there from the summer of June 1652 to 1654, with a few months back in London in 1653. And he's really frustrated there because he can't do the chemistry he wants to do. So he has to content himself with doing these experiments in anatomy with William Petty. And so together they dissect a couple of human cadavers, but dogs, mice, pigs, frogs, and a lot of fish. They're doing these experiments in Dublin, and fish are plentiful, and yeah, a lot of fish. So he's familiar theoretically with anatomy, and we can say with confidence that he's read these anatomy books prior to his time in Ireland, or at least during his time in Ireland. The first, of course, is the greatest anatomy work ever written. But he's up to, if you look through it, he's kind of up to speed with the current theoretical works in anatomy, including notably Nathaniel Highmore. And I'm hoping, I can already tell I'm not going to get to talk as much about Highmore as I think warrants. But Highmore is Boyle's neighbor, lives about 6 miles away from Stallbridge. He's Petty's cousin, and he's very important. And some of you might actually know more about Highmore than I do. But he's the first to publish an endorsement of Harvey's account of the circulation of the blood. And even more importantly, for today's discussion, he's the first to explicitly claim that the heart works like a pump. Harvey implies it, but Highmore's more explicit about it. And Boyle is able to meet the aged Harvey, and his account of that comes much later, and it can't quite be trusted. But there is evidence that he met Harvey, but he got to witness some of Highmore's dissections before he went to Ireland. But it's more observations, and it's not the kind of hands-on stuff he does when he gets to Ireland under Petty. So yeah, not to rush, but I have to say a couple of words about William Petty. Just a fascinating figure in early modern philosophy. Most people that study him are into history of economics. But he's an important natural philosopher, aside from his innovations in economics. He's a founding member of the Royal Society. He's part of the Hartlib Circle. His father, and so just really quickly, he's sort of the opposite of Boyle in a lot of ways, because he doesn't have this inheritance to fall back on. He's interested in the same things, some of the same things as Boyle, but he has to make his own way. His father and his grandfather are cloth merchants, and they arrange for him to be a cabin boy. And he's a cabin boy as a child for a couple of years, but early on he breaks his leg. And to save his life, they set him ashore, and these Jesuit monks on the north of France take him in, heal him, and educate him. So he gets this kind of free Cartesian-like education. Cartesian in the sense it's a similar education to what Descartes has. He goes back to sea just briefly, but winds up, as most people do, in Holland, where he learns anatomy. He even gets to become Hobbes's secretary. He gets to meet some of the intellectuals Hobbes hangs out with. And then he just, I'm trying to wrap up who Petty is and what he's doing in Ireland. He makes it to Oxford and gets a job. They had a professor of anatomy, but he was kind of squeamish. at Oxford, and he liked the old days where you just read out of Galen and you had some barber do the dissection. But Petty had experience doing the actual dissection. So he's working there as a professor of anatomy, and he gets a job going over with Cromwell, basically in an invasion of Ireland. And Petty basically uses the new philosophy to kind of carve up Ireland and divvy it up for Cromwell. But that's what he's doing there. And the first real letter, as you see, that Boyle, that he sends to Boyle while he's in Ireland, is really to cure Boyle's headaches. He's reading up to 12 hours a day. He's frustrated because he can't do chemistry. So he's just trying to content himself with reading, and he's getting these headaches from it. And so there's this famous letter to Clodius, who is Hartlib's son-in-law. And, you know, Boyle's just frustrated. Boyle doesn't quite hate Ireland as much as this implies. He spent his childhood there. He had the Bible, you know, translated into Irish, but he's definitely frustrated. So he says, I live here in a barbarous country where chemical spirits are so misunderstood and chemical instruments so unprocurable that it's hard to have any hermetic thoughts in it and impossible to bring them to experiment. It goes on in the same letter. Let me see if I can see the whole thing. Sorry. For my part, that I may not live wholly useless or altogether a stranger in the study of nature, since I want glasses and furnaces to make a chemical analysis of inanimate bodies, I'm exercising myself in making anatomical dissections of living animals. So they are some vivisections, unfortunately. Wherein, being assisted by your father-in-law's ingenious friend, Dr. Petty, our general's physician, I've satisfied myself of the circulation of the blood and the freshly discovered and hardly discoverable receptaculum chili made by the confluence of the veni lacti, and have seen, especially in the dissections of fishes, so again with the fishes, more of the variety and contrivance of nature and the majesty and wisdom of her author than all the books I've ever read in my life could give me convincing notions of. So that's a big statement for Boyle to make. He loves to read, but yeah, he's seen more of. So he's coming at it from this teleological point of view, where he sees non-human, well, all animals, including humans, as these divinely designed machines. And so he thinks you can learn more about the universe and God's creation by cutting up fish than you can by reading books. And that's a direct influence, I think, from Petty. Boyle had read Bacon, but Petty's showing him how to put it into real practice. And so just this quote from Usefulness of Natural Philosophy. This was published in 1663, but it's written in the late 1650s in reference to this, I think, in reference to these experiments he's doing. And so he's just talking about how important anatomy is. And so the Usefulness of Natural Philosophy is a big work. It comes in kind of two parts. The first part is just about how exploring the natural world gives us a greater appreciation for the power and glory of God. You know, he's made this intricate nature for us to explore. The second part is more about the practical uses of natural philosophy for things like medicine. So this is from the first part. So one would think that conversing with dead and stinking carcasses that are not only hideous objects in themselves, but made more ghastly by putting us in mind that ourselves must be such, should not only be a very melancholy, but a very hated employment. And yet, there are anatomists who dote upon it. And I confess its instructiveness has not only reconciled me to it, that I've often spent hours much less delightfully, not only in courts, but even in libraries, and that's saying something for Boyle, than in tracing in those forsaken mansions the inimitable workmanship of the omniscient architect. I love that phrase, forsaken mansion. Yeah, another similar passage. The curious work of famous artists are wont to invite the visits and excite the wonder and generality of inquisitive persons. And I remember that in my travels, I've often taken no small pain to obtain the pleasure of gazing upon some masterpiece of art. But now I confess I could look with more delight upon a skillful dissection than the famous clock at Strasbourg. He sees the importance of anatomy in kind of discovering the wonder of God's creation. But what part of my idea is that when you use experimental observations to decide between competing structural explanations, you get this kind of scientific progress. And I think it happens a lot in Boyle's works, but I think it happens for the first time in these Dublin experiments. And they set some of the sort of things he puts into practice at later stages of his philosophy, not just in chemistry, but especially in pneumatics. A lot, if you look at he's really got kind of a knack. If you look at Spring of the Air, written in the late 1650s, of finding ways to use controlled experimental observations to decide between competing structural explanations. And so here the competing mechanical explanations are of the heart's function. And on the one hand, we have Harvey, who says it works like a pump. And on the other hand, we have Descartes, who says it works like a furnace. And Descartes goes into more detail in other places, but at the time, this is the only work of Descartes that Boyle had read. In the early 1660s, he reads the whole corpus of Descartes from, no pun intended, and it's kind of taught Cartesian philosophy from Robert Hooke. But at this time, he had read The Passions of the Soul. So here's the account of Descartes that a lot of you will know more than I do. While we are alive, there is a continual heat in our hearts, which is a kind of fire that the blood of the veins maintains there. This fire is the corporeal principle underlying all movements of our limbs. When the new blood has entered the heart, it immediately is rarefied in the same way as before. This and this alone is what the pulse or beating of the heart and arteries consists in. And it explains why the beating is repeated each time new blood enters the heart. It's also the sole cause of the movement of the blood, making it flow constantly and very rapidly in all the arteries and veins, so that it carries the heat it acquires in the heart to all the other parts of the body and provides them with nourishment. So now, this idea that the heart is a furnace and it heats the blood isn't new with Descartes. In fact, that's pretty orthodox scaling. But what's going on with Descartes is he's saying it's heating the blood that causes the circulation. Let's see. He gets into this debate again that it's pretty famous with Plempius. So Plempius makes a couple of claims. First, he points out that even in the heart of a fish, again with the fish, even though the heart of a fish is warmer than other parts of their body, it's not warm enough to rarefy the blood or rarefy it as fast as Descartes' view requires. He says that our hands are warmer than a fish's heart and points out that you can't rarefy fish blood. And then he points out that the hearts of many animals continue to react to stimuli long after it's removed from the body. So I know I'm running out of time, but I want to mention this very interesting, well-known letter from Descartes to Plempius regarding this. So he says, you cite the coldness of fish as a reason for saying that the blood in the hearts of fish is not rarefied through heat. But if you were with me now, you would have to admit that even in the coldest of animals, the movement in question is due to heat. For you would see that the tiny heart of an eel, which I cut out before 7 or 8 o'clock this morning, revives when a little heat is applied to its surface and begins to beat again quite rapidly, even though it is obviously dead and already dry on the surface. Now, to show you that this effect requires not only heat, but also a flow of blood into this, I am now pouring into this heart blood from the same eel which I had kept for this purpose. I then warm up the heart and it begins to beat just as rapidly and vigorously as it did in the live animal. And then this is just typical Descartes. Note that these experiments don't always give the same results. For all sorts of reasons, the results vary. But if they are considered impartially, they will always confirm my view. Now what I think is particularly interesting about this is we know from the great Dan Carver that the role that experiment plays in Descartes' natural philosophy is sort of different than in Boyle's. For Descartes, he's a great experimental philosopher too, but for him, usually the experiments help in this project of reducing a scientific question to more basic questions until ideally you get to some a question so basic that the answer for it is self-evident. And from there, you can deduce back up to the original question. And Descartes' account of the rainbow is a great example. But here you see something very different. He's giving this experiment he's asking Plempius to repeat it, and he thinks it falsifies, it empirically confirms his hypothesis against Harvey. So I think that's really interesting. Just to mention George Matane, just in passing, just the idea that what's causing the heat of the heart is still very much up for grabs a generation later. George Martin says that the heat is caused by the velocity of the blood moving through the vessels. So it's not till a generation after these guys that you get a good account of what causes body heat. Really, all of the muscles working produce body heat, and part of it is just better thermometer technology, which Boyle himself kind of instantiated, but didn't really live to see it perfected. And once you get a pretty good mercury thermometer, you can at least do an understanding of body heat. From Galen to Descartes, it was all subjective. You could subjectively kind of feel that the core of the body was hotter. But this is the clincher for me. So again, this is from the second part of Boyle's usefulness of experimental natural philosophy. And it shows directly that he's using empirical observation to try and decide between two equally mechanical theories. In the context here, he's talking about how dissecting both animals and humans, even dissecting non-human animals, teaches you something about the human body, because you can perform a greater variety of dissections. In dissecting different kinds of animals, you can see how the same or similar organs function differently and so on. But yeah, he says, this is Boyle now, if you dexterously take out the hearts of vipers and of some smaller fishes, whose coldness makes them beat much more unfrequently and leisurely than those of warm animals, the contraction and relaxation of the fibers of the heart may be distinctly observed in order to the deciding of, or reconciling, the controversy about the cause and manner of the heart's motion between those learned modern anatomists that contend, some of them for Dr. Harvey's opinion and others for the Cartesians. So he thinks you can use these controlled experimental observations to decide between Harvey or Descartes. And really probably first by reading Highmore's book and observing some of Highmore's dissections, but then just seeing it in multiple examples with fish under Petty's guidance, he goes for Harvey. And then I don't have to read all these. Boyle's a bit long-winded, but this is a good passage from the same book where he shows the connection between anatomy and chemistry. This one, there's a great part where he pretty much comes out and says that this shows the relationship between anatomy and mechanical philosophy. And there's a part where he says, unless you're really good at the mechanical philosophy, unless you're well versed in mechanical philosophy, you're not going to be a very good philosophical anatomist. But for some reason, I missed that quote. I have the whole quote and missed that. But here he points out that when he says you have to be familiar with mechanical principles, he points out it's not only mathematical and theoretical, but it's also hands-on mechanisms. And this is a quote about how it's really first noted by Vesalius that really you need a variety of specimens to dissect before you can make any kind of generalization. And then let me see how I'm doing for time. Oh my God, I'll wrap up really quickly. Just to kind of counterbalance what I've been talking about, you have to point out Thomas Sydenham, another one of Boyle's neighbors from a later period of his life, one of the most famous doctors of his day. He is a Baconian. He's also believes in the mechanical philosophy, but he doesn't believe in the value of anatomy and wrote a whole book on it. So I thought he'd be interesting to end with. So according to Sydenham, the anatomy, that anatomy is like to afford any great improvement in the practice of physics, or assist a man in the finding out and establishing a true method, I have reason to doubt. All that anatomy can do is to show us the gross and sensible parts of the body, or the vapid and dead juices, all of which, after the most diligent search, will be no more able to direct a physician how to cure a disease than how to make a man. And then this one, for suppose someone, well, I won't read the whole thing. I'll read it from about halfway down. Even if you were really good at dissection, what would disadvantage his method, or would disadvantage his method or guide him to first medicines? How know he hereby that rhubarb or pillatory have in them fit wedges to divide the blood and other particles in them fitted to open these passages? How to regulate his dose, to mix his simples, and to prescribe all in his due method. All this is only from the history and the advantage of a diligent observation of these diseases, of their beginning, their progress, ways of cure, which a physician can do, may as well do without a scrupulous inquiry into the anatomy of the past. So Sydenham's a big Baconian, and he's also all for like a natural history of medicine, where you do this kind of collection of observations. He just doesn't think it requires anatomy. And so just some concluding remarks. Apologies if I went over time. I know I've kind of rushed through it, but I think the Irish anatomy experiments taught Boyle several things that influenced his later work, basically his scientific practice. First, they solidified Boyle's endorsement of the mechanical philosophy. He was sympathetic before, but now he's really endorsed it. He learned the need, and again, this is first stressed by Vesalius, for multiple experiments, one observation being insufficient evidence to refute a theory, given the individual specimens and background conditions vary greatly. So you can't make generalizations after one dissection. You have to make lots of dissections. He learned not to rely on authority for scientific truth. I mean, that's easy to say now, and but I think that's where he really first sees it. He learned that the best authority is your own experience and a careful observation, and only really to accept past authority after your own experiments have confirmed it. And finally, I think he learned that experimental evidence should be the deciding factor between competing mechanical explanations. So yeah, thanks a lot, and I'm sorry if I went over time.
Thank you, Bill. I propose we take questions now. We already have a question in the chat, and we do that for the next 8 minutes, and then we go to the next speaker. So how about Jo beginning with her question? Jo Hedison.
Yes, well, it was more of a comment. I mean, I was thinking that Bill's point about the authority, the questioning of authority, depends on basically when you look at Chinese history. I mean, basically the let's say the heyday of Chinese natural philosophy seems to have occurred somewhere about 1,000 years before in the West. During the Han Dynasty, especially somewhere between 200 BC and let's say 500 AD. So, and I think during that time there was plenty questioning of authority as far as I learned. It's just that yes, I mean China didn't produce the same kind of science as the West, but that may be basically just the way each area is you know, about the goals that these areas, I mean, what they thought it was important to achieve. I mean, for China, it was obviously things like immortality and this kind of thing, while for the West, it was more of, let's say, more practical, more empirical products, maybe. But this is a general comment, and it's a bit unrelated to the subject.
I think it's very interesting. And you're right, it's futile to make any kind of generalizations about such a complex culture. But there's plenty about alchemists in the early modern period that were trying to find the elixir of life and things too. And it's also all these innovations sort of hit Western Europe in a shorter time frame, in the space of about 300 or 400 years, where a lot of them are very different in China. But yeah, no, thank you for that comment. That's an excellent point.
Next question, Gideon Manik.
Thanks. Thanks, Bill. It was really interesting. So I want to ask a question that I think puts a bow around a couple of the figures you mentioned, and it has to do with the value of anatomy, and then this kind of divide within the field of medicine between practice and clinical delivery and causal or greater knowledge of the bodies at issue, right? So when Harvey presents his view, and it's criticized roundly, I mean, not everyone, obviously, but initially, one of the defenses he offers is that it couldn't be more traditional, that it doesn't threaten medicine. And what he means by that, of course, is medical practice, right? The kinds of interventions we do. And then he continues to be a fairly orthodox physician himself, right? So Boyle, in finding value in anatomy and being drawn into the Hartlett circle through his sister and others, I mean, the interest there is in the delivery of a, clinical medicine of some kind, right? It's not just about the theory, it's about the practice. And when Sydenham criticizes anatomy, you made it sound, to me at least, this is how I heard it, as though it's a really robust criticism of anatomy. But Sydenham's not criticizing anatomy per se, he's criticizing the thought that it will change how clinical practice, medical delivery is done. So there's a kind of continuity in the view of someone like Harvey and Sydenham, it seems like, or one could make that claim. And I wanted to invite you to, if there's something worth clarifying here, to help me see where the criticism really lies and where Boyle is pressing the value of anatomy as opposed to chemistry, say, in the delivery of medicine and therapeutics.
Yeah, I was rushed for time, so I didn't know how much to talk about Sydenham at the end. But he has similar thoughts about chemistry. You can do this chemical analysis, which Boyle was very into, of the different substances of the human body that the human body is composed of. But Sydenham thinks its practical application it isn't great. He admits you need to know some anatomy, but he thinks to be a practicing physician, like the kind of thing that, say, Locke wanted to do, it's of limited value, which I think just history has shown that he's wrong. If you look at something like, say, heart disease, if you do a lot of dissections, you can see what's causing it in a way that I don't think Sydenham really stressed, at least. So it wasn't so much that he thought anatomy wasn't important. He just didn't think it was that important to the actual practice of medicine. But yeah, I don't know.
But I think
for Boyle himself, just really quickly, his own once he gets back to Oxford, his hands-on interests shift to chemistry and pneumatics and things like that. But he's still got active interest in anatomy. He just doesn't get his hands dirty. He has other people like Richard Lohr and Thomas Willis do it for him. But he's still very, very interested.
Right. I mean, one of the things I was just going to say, though, real quickly, is that it seems like Boyle's investment in chemistry is different from his investment in anatomy as a way of influencing the delivery of an improved therapeutics. I mean, those thoughts of Boyle that you can't use medicines with 50 ingredients because you're never going to know which one is really the efficacious source of the result. I mean, and limiting it to 3, it seems like he sees a difference in the value for medical practice. But I see there are other questions. So
no, thank you for that. That's very interesting.
There are 2 more questions, and I would like people to address them both. But can you make it short, if possible? Dolores, perhaps. Dolores, Yorizo first. You have to unmute yourself.
I think Benny was ahead of me, so I don't want to butt in. Should I just ask my question?
Go ahead, Dolores.
Good, because I'm scared of Dolores' question anyway.
So if you take the position you want Boyle to have a consistent view in his philosophical position, it's really confusing because from what from your presentation, he's got influences from Bacon, he's got influences from Descartes, he's gone to Holland where there's an actual conflict of, as it were, a conflict of interest between Baconianism and Cartesianism. But then when you say there's a debate between Harvey and the mechanists, he goes for Harvey, and that's Aristotelian. So I'm a little confused about where you're placing Boyle philosophically, because there is this tension within his philosophy. So what I see in your presentation is a really very different kind of Boyle than what you get with Michael Hunter, which is much more streamlined and anti-Galenist and pro new philosophy. But so I wonder if you could clarify that. So I mean, I'm not attacking you. It's just that there are these different forces within Boyle, and I'm trying to pick them apart, and maybe you have some insights that I could benefit from.
I can't very quickly. But one thing I agree with your assessment, what you're saying about Harvey, but he's doing it more with Highmore, who's kind of more of a Gassendian than Harvey ever is. So there's that, and I think Boyle, like a lot of these people, is a complex character who has several different influences, and the kind of standard view from Davis and Hunter and Anstey, at least endorse it, is that after the early 1660s, philosophically, Boyle essentially becomes a Cartesian. And so I know my interpretation is different. I think I think Descartes' influence on Boyle was both less and earlier than the standard view. I think at heart, he's really a Baconian, and even later, he's just using Cartesian terminology to express his own ideas. But a lot of the tension there is kind of artificial. So yeah, I'd love to talk more about it. But
maybe at the very end of the session, Benny Goldberg, if you can make it really quick.
Sorry.
I'll just withdraw my question because Dolores really covered some of the same ground I was going to ask. So thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we can move to our next speaker, but not before thanking Bill for this talk. So let's do that.
Thank you.
Our next talk tonight, Marina Banchetti Robino, the role of negative empirical concepts in Sennett and in Boyle.
Okay, let me try to share my screen. And can everybody see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Okay. Okay, I have to, for some strange reason, I have to give permission to Zoom. Hold on a second here.
Well, we are talking about the philosophy of experiment, so experimenting
Yes.
continues.
Exactly. Okay. Let me try again. Can you
Yes,
see
this
it?
time is working.
Excellent,
Yes.
excellent, excellent. Okay, let me just do this. And perfect. All right. The experiment worked. Can you hear me well? Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the seminar for inviting me to participate. I'm very honored to be on this panel with the other participants, Michelle and Bill. And my talk today is going to be on the role of negative empirical concepts in Sennert and Boyle. The presentation will begin by examining the manner in which the chemical philosophy of Daniel Sennert mediates between the scholastic theory of substantial form and the Democritean atomism by postulating what he calls hylomorphic atoms as the fundamental particles of matter. I will then discuss the explanatory power of Sennert's negative empirical notion of substance, and as well, he also holds an operational notion of substance as the limits attained by chemical analysis. And then I will discuss how he uses the experiment of the reduction to the pristine state to lend empirical support to his theory of material substance. And although Sennert is not the first to conduct this type of experiment, he really is one of the first to use the experiment for theoretical reasons, to lend support to a particular conception of material substance. The paper will also, towards the end, discuss how the work of Sennert actually had an impact on later chemists, and in particular on Robert Boyle, who adopted the experimental procedure of reduction to the pristine state to support his own negative empirical conception of mechanistic chemical atoms as the final products of chemical analysis. I have a little disclaimer. Perhaps 2/3 of the paper will be on Sennert and the latter part on Boyle, since I think probably Sennert is not as well known. Obviously, his ideas are perhaps not as well known as those of Boyle. So I begin by introducing Sennert. He lived from 1572 to 1637. And I guess the most important book, the one from which a lot of the ideas I'm discussing today are taken, is his De Chemicorum, concerning the consensus and dissent of the chemists with the Aristotelians and Galenists of 1619. Now, by way of introduction, I want to talk about the difference between earlier assessments of Sennert's place in the history of chemistry versus the way that we assess his importance today. As an example of the earlier view on Sennert's contributions, I want to cite Mary Boas, who claims that Sennert contributed nothing new to the development of a mechanical philosophy based upon a theory of atoms. She says this in 1952 in her article on the establishment of the mechanical philosophy. Recent assessments of Sennert, however, see him as an archetypal transitional figure. First of all, he represents an early attempt at conceptualizing atomism in a kind of post-Paracelsian alchemy. Secondly, he anticipates the role that structuralism would play in modern chemistry. And as Bill mentioned earlier, here we're talking about the early modern kind of view of structure, okay? Such as the one, for example, that we find in Boyle as well. His experiment of the reduction to the pristine state became a crucial experiment for later chemists, such as Boyle. And his negative empirical conception of atomicity, elementarity, substance in general influenced later chemists, Boyle in particular, but we also find a similar notion later in Lavoisier. Although I have no evidence that Lavoisier read Sennert, but certainly the negative empirical conception was important for Lavoisier. So let me say a little bit about what we mean when we talk about negative empirical concepts. A negative empirical concept was first, the term negative empirical concept was first used by David Knight in 1967 in his Atoms and Elements, and was later reappropriated by Arnold Thackeray in Atoms and Powers in 1970. And in their very important Histoire de la chimie of 1992, Bernadette Bonsaud-Vincent and Isabelle Stengers also used the notion of a negative empirical concept to explain, in particular, Robert Boyle's conception of chemical atoms. In fact, this concept, according to William Newman, seems to actually go back. He says already in the Middle Ages, if not earlier, alchemists were employing this approach. According to this analytical ideal, a substance is viewed as elementary if it cannot be further decomposed by the tool of the alchemists. So here we have the makings of this notion of a negative empirical concept. In fact, William Newman traces this notion all the way back to Geber's Summa Perfectionis in the 13th century. Basically, the idea of a negative empirical concept is a purely epistemological notion. It represents a new type of argument that locates the authority of proof not within reason, but within experimental practice. So it's the idea of defining substance, or at least the ultimate substance, in terms of what can operationally be achieved through chemical analysis. So even though one may posit something even more fundamental than what can be reduced by chemical analysis, at least the notion of elementarity can be understood, even if only provisionally, in terms of the final elements of analysis. Now, let me say a few words about Sennert's hylomorphic atomism here, because his hylomorphic atomism combines two different conceptions of substance. It, in some ways, reconceptualizes what I refer to here as the scholastic theory of substantial form, which is hylomorphism. According to the scholastics, immaterial forms endow prime matter with qualities. Each element is determined in its essential properties by the presence of a distinctive substantial form. Now, when we start applying this concept of substantial form to chemistry, for example, a certain problem emerges, which is the problem that Sennert was trying to address with his own hylomorphic atomism. And we find this, for example, in Aquinas, who believes that the substantial forms of individual ingredients of a mixed are destroyed and replaced by the substantial form of the mixed as a whole. Okay. A genuine mixed for someone like Aquinas is a homogeneous thing because it has its own distinctive substantial form. And at that point, the substantial forms of the components of that mix have disappeared. Okay. So for example, if he doesn't use this example, I'm using it just to illustrate, something like sodium chloride for Aquinas would have its own substantial form, and that would account for the properties that distinguish sodium chloride from sodium and from chloride, or from chlorine, I'm sorry. And of course, once these two elements are mixed, their substantial form disappears. And the consequence of that, at least for someone like Aquinas, is that the ingredients of the mixed are not recoverable. Okay. Now, Aquinas would say that if the ingredients were recoverable, then it's not a genuine mix. Okay. So if it's a genuine mix, the ingredients are not recoverable. And of course, Sennert is going to disagree with this. The second conception of substance that Sennert is trying to incorporate in his hylomorphic atomism is the classical Democritean atomism. Okay. The idea that the most fundamental parts of matter are atoms, and that atoms are substantially uniform, and they are distinguished only by the mechanistic properties of shape, size, spatial orientation, and motion or rest. And I specify Democritean because clearly this is pre-Gassendian, okay? So he's working here with a traditional classical view of atomism. Now, Sennert's structural hylomorphism basically stipulates that the most fundamental particles of matter are atoms, okay? These are discrete, indivisible particles. But that each atom is endowed with a distinctive substantial form. So what Sennert does is that instead of saying that substance as a whole has a substantial form, what he's arguing is that the particular atoms of substance each have substantial form, okay? And the substantial form of a given atom is what accounts for that particular atom's identity, unity, and stability through change, all right? The substantial form is also what makes a given atom the type of atom that it is. So an atom of sodium is an atom of sodium because it has a particular substantial form that distinguishes it from an atom of chlorine, which of course has a different substantial form, okay? So when we have atoms of sodium coming together, because they all share the same kind of substantial form, okay, they form one substance. The atoms of chlorine form a different one. But again, it is not, you know, the substance as a whole that has the substantial form, but rather the particles of that substance, okay? Another element of Sennert's structural hylomorphic atomism is that it implies a hierarchical ontology. According to Sennert, the most fundamental and indivisible particles of matter, the ones that have the substantial form, are the minima naturalia. However, the minima compound together, so to speak, to form what we might call the prima mixta, right? This is really the first level of complexity in which these atoms are compounded together to form what, not so much we might call molecules, but perhaps something like what Gassendi would call molecules, okay? Because obviously this is a completely different notion of molecules from what we have today. These molecules, these prima mixta, right, are essentially microstructural arrangements of atoms. So what we find in Sennert is already a kind of a structural view, okay? And this microstructure, in some ways, is what gives these compounded prima mixta their distinctive properties, okay? And so this is what I say in the next point. The distinctive microstructure accounts for the distinctive property of the prima mixta, which are different or may be different from those of its component atoms. So if we have a prima mixta that is all made up of atoms of sodium, then it's going to have one set of properties. But if we have a prima mixta that is made up of atoms of sodium with chlorine, there's going to have different properties, okay? So, but the structure of this is what's going to account for its properties. And then finally, there are going to be higher orders of compounded corpuscles at varying degrees of complexity. Now, there are some advantages to Sennert's structural hylomorphic atomism over the scholastic theory of substantial form. In part because, according to Sennert, because it is the atoms that are endowed with distinctive substantial forms that determine their specific qualities, and that it is the structural arrangement that determines the properties of a homogeneous substance, his theory of mixts does not imply the impossibility of recovering the components from a mixed, right? So the mix itself does not have a distinctive substantial form. The qualitative characteristics of the mix are due to the structural arrangements of the atoms that are its ingredients. The substantial forms of the atoms are preserved in the mixed. And so therefore, this implies the possibility of recovering the individual ingredients of the mixed via analysis. So it's in this way that he tries to address this problem that we saw earlier with the scholastic view. And so one of the experiments, or perhaps the most important experiment that Sennert uses to, in some ways, lend empirical support to these ideas is the reduction to the pristine state. He uses this experiment then to support his hylomorphic atomism by showing that the ingredients of a mix can indeed be recovered, and thus that the atoms of the ingredients retain their substantial forms even within the mixed. The validity of the experiment is supported, according to Sennert, by the scholastic axiom, the things into which composites can be dissolved are the things out of which they are made. But again, these composites at least according to Aquinas, are not genuine mixed. Okay, he wants to distinguish that from a composite. Now, as I think I mentioned earlier, Sennert was not the first to conduct this experiment, since several alchemists and iatrochemists have performed it before him. However, he is the first to conduct the experiment for theoretical purposes, that is, to provide empirical support for his theory of substance. The experiment was carried out in the Indiana University Chemistry Department and Laboratory of Catherine Reck, and was discussed in William Newman's Atoms and Alchemy. In fact, the images that I'm using here are from that book because they are the clearest images that I could find. And it's the clearest sort of reproduction of this experiment, I believe, that is out there. So first, a thin sheet of silver, partially cut into small pieces, serves as the starting point of the reduction. A clear blue solution of aqua fortis, which is nitric acid, and the dissolved silver remains once, okay, I'm sorry. Let's see. Sorry. So we have, we have dissolved silver, okay, and gold. And once the dissolved silver remains, once the precipitated gold, has been separated from the liquid phase, okay? Sennert filters the blue liquid to establish that no solid residue remains, and a solution of salt of tartar is used as, is poured into the clear blue liquid to initiate the precipitation, okay? The precipitate, which is, of course, a curdled mass of mostly yellow silver carbonate, is recovered. And he believes that in doing this, that he has recovered pure silver. So he mixes silver and gold, and then he precipitates the silver out. And he filters this precipitate and washes it. Now, the filtered and washed silver carbonate then is heated in a crucible to yield metallic silver, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. And when he heats the precipitate, he believes he has essentially recovered silver, the same silver, okay? The metallic silver is then cooled in the crucible, and an approximate amount of silver is recovered that is very close to the original silver used at the beginning of the experiment. Okay, so again, it's not the exact same amount, but it's close enough that Sennert believes he has essentially dissolved the silver and then been able to recover it back using this procedure. And of course, in his view, okay, this is evidence that the atoms, that the hylomorphic atoms of the silver have retained their substantial form after the dissolution, okay? And so essentially in the dissolved silver, those atoms remain and can be recovered through this process, okay? So what he concludes from this experiment is if aqua fortis is poured onto the silver, the silver is so thoroughly dissolved that no metal can be detected in the water by sight. So we see that here, right? There's no metal detected in the water by sight or in the liquid by sight. But since it is really present, in other words, the silver is still in there, at least the atoms of the silver are still in there in their substantial forms, it can emerge thence in segregated form, in other words, precipitated, and certainly in such a way that the silver retains its own nature, okay, as can be seen when it is cooled in the crucible. The metal preserved its own unchanged nature in the solution, and it is easily precipitated at the bottom in the form of a very fine powder, which may then be reduced again into the metal, okay? Thus, also, if a single mass be made by fusion of gold, which is what I was showing earlier, and they come together through the smallest atoms to the degree that no one may recognize that this body consists of different components, still each metal, in other words, the gold and the silver, retains its own form in those minimal atoms and can be separated by aqua fortis and can be reduced to its original body. So recovery of the gold and the silver. So these are two different versions of the reduction. One involves only silver, the other involves silver and gold. Now, here's the connection between the reduction to the pristine state and negative empirical concepts. Okay. The analytical tools that Sennert has used in this experiment, the aquafortis, have not succeeded in breaking down the particles of the metal, and therefore the particles are operationally atomic. The recovery of the metal proves that the atoms of the metal retain their substantial forms. And so the products of analysis then can be said to be compounded corpuscles of a higher compositional stage. They are not minima naturalia, okay? And so what we find is a operational conception of atomicity, okay, as operational indivisibility. What this means then is that it may not be the case that these particles are ontologically indivisible, right? It might be possible for nature or for God, I'm sorry, to dissolve them or to break them apart. However, chemically, one cannot do so. And so this is why this is referred to as a negative empirical concept, because it's a concept that is defined in terms of what cannot be done experimentally to these substances. They cannot be subdivided. And so one of the important contributions that is made by Daniel Sennert here is that essentially, as Stengers and Vincent have claimed, the operations that brought reversibility to the fore inspired a new classification of chemical procedures that theoretically favored purification processes. His hylomorphic atomism, again, is transitional between the scholastic theory of substantial form and the mechanistic corpuscularian theory of matter. It represents a hybrid compositional theory that shows the interplay between structural and substantial types of explanations, or we might say between structural and compositional chemistry. It is also an illustration of I guess what in some sense is one of the major topics of today's seminar, which is the interaction between philosophical reasoning and experiment. The reduction to the pristine state shows that synthesis and analysis can be both used in the context of a demonstrative proof of a particular theory of substance, okay? And of course, as I mentioned earlier, this negative empirical approach and the operational concept of atomicity and later elementarity for Lavoisier certainly had a great deal of influence on chemists after Sennert. And so we see that in Traité élémentaire de chimie, Lavoisier says the term element should be restricted to the last point which analysis is capable of reaching, all the substance into which we are capable by any means to reduce bodies by decomposition. Now, I'm sort of running a little bit quickly through this because I see that I'm close to being out of time. Now, there's a critique that I want to present of Sennert and then suggest how this, of course, influences Boyle. Obviously, Sennert fails ultimately to support his hylomorphic atomism with this experiment because the results of the reduction to the pristine state are not sufficient to establish his theory. In fact, the scholastic idea of the mixed would be perfectly capable of explaining the reversibility of the synthesis here, right? The scholastic natural philosopher would simply reply to Sennert that the clear blue solution resulting from pouring the aquafortis on the silver is not really a genuine mixed, precisely because the silver is recoverable from the solution, okay? So they can get around this. So this is a clear case of the underdetermination of theory by evidence, right? Because the recovery of the silver from the solution is in fact compatible with both the scholastic conception of mixed and also with Sennert's hylomorphic atomism. So which are of course incompatible hypotheses. In fact, this experiment is also compatible with Boyle's mechanistic conception of chemical atoms, okay? So this very same experiment is later used by Boyle to support precisely a mechanistic conception of microstructure, okay, and of chemical atoms. So the concept of substantial form, whether in its scholastic or Sennertian iteration, still remains unclear. Although Sennert attempts to resolve some of the issues associated with scholastic notion by transferring substantial forms from substances to their constituent atoms, he still doesn't explain exactly what a substantial form is. It remains an ephemeral notion, okay? In fact, it is precisely the notion of substantial form that Boyle seeks to reject when he embraces the mechanical philosophy. At least it's one of the many things he wants to reject as a superior alternative for explaining chemical reactions and changes, and more specifically, synthesis and analysis. There's a sense in which Boyle, and I use this term very carefully, there's a sense in which Boyle naturalizes the concept of form by replacing immaterial substantial forms, or this ephemeral notion of substantial form, which can lead to circular explanations, with mechanistic microstructure, which he calls texture and can also be called essential form, because he believes that this microstructure is responsible for the essential properties of a substance. For Boyle, the structural arrangement of primary corpuscles that he calls corpuscular concretions, and also that William Newman has called chemical atoms, is what accounts for the essential properties of a homogeneous substance, including its chemical properties and its chemical stability. Boyle then employs this same reduction to the pristine state to establish experimentally the existence of stable corpuscular concretions whose microstructure cannot be further reduced by ordinary chemical means. Although he does believe in the possibility of transmutation, he does practice chrysopoeia, so therefore he believes that these microstructures can theoretically be analyzed with the alkahest, thereby allowing for essential transmutation, but they cannot be further analyzed by chemical means. And so because such stable corpuscular concretions, cannot be analyzed by ordinary chemical means, there's a sense in which these concretions can be considered as being operationally atomic, if you will, although they are not ontologically so. And this is why Newman actually chooses to call them chemical atoms, because he's trying to capture this idea of their operational irreducibility. And so we see here that although Sennert and Boyle worked within entirely different theoretical paradigms, one was vitalistic, the other mechanistic, one believes in substantial form, the other doesn't, they do both share a negative empirical conception of fundamentality or atomicity. That is, atomicity as defined by the limits of chemical analysis. And I'm sorry I rushed through this last part. Although Boyle considers corpuscular concretions as ontologically analyzable in principle, they are operationally irreducible by ordinary chemical analysis and can therefore be considered as chemically elementary entities, okay, from which emerge chemical properties. This is the end of my talk. This is my bibliography, and I apologize for rushing through the last bit because I was running out of time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Marina. Let's try to see what we can do by asking questions and opening the discussion. So maybe you want to stop sharing?
I did. Did I? No.
Now we actually see a wonderful pumpkin.
Okay,
but...
let me see. Let me see if I can do that. Okay, hold on. Okay, so no. Give me a second here.
Meanwhile, people can signal by raising hands or by addressing questions in the chat, whether they want to raise questions or comments.
Just a quick question. Could you say something about how this allows Boyle, this operational definition allows Boyle to treat atoms as sort of natural kinds?
He does believe in the existence, at least I argue in my book that he does believe in the existence of natural kinds, because he does believe that these chemical atoms have stability. In a way that, and again, in the book, I talk about him and Locke, right? Locke has a much more, I guess, conventionalist view, you might say, than Boyle. And in parts because Boyle does believe that it's possible to identify the essence of substances by precisely identifying those properties without which a particular substance is no longer that type of substance, right?
Can
And
a-
again,
can a
through
chemical-
through these reductions, those can be identified. Yes.
Just quickly, can what counts as a chemical atom today be different than tomorrow as technology maybe improves, since it's an operational definition?
Well, I mean, I don't know about that, but it's certainly an operational definition, at least for Boyle, I would argue. I don't know if it's an operational definition so much for us today, because nowadays, of course, we no longer believe that atoms are fundamental or irreducible, right? But at least in terms of ordinary chemical means, that's what they are for Boyle. So I would say that the negative empirical concept really really plays a very important role in early modern chemistry all the way up to the point of the chemical revolution. Because again, even for Lavoisier, what we call elements is simply a provisional term that is a function of how far we can get in terms of reduction or analysis.
Right. Benny Goldberg, I think, was next.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed your talk. So I hope this isn't too far afield, but I wondered if you could say or talk a little bit about whether Sennert uses this same argument when he talks about seeds and souls in the case of living matter. Does he make a similar kind of analogy about the relationship between gold and silver as dissolved and the recoverability of silver in the case of the soul in the seed? Is there a similar kind of relationship there? Or if
I can't answer your question because, to be honest with you, my own focus on Sennert has been primarily regarding, this particular issue and this particular problem with addressing substantial forms and dealing with the scholastic view. But I didn't go so far into Sennert as to examine these other questions. So unfortunately, I can't answer.
No, that's fine. Thanks.
Sure.
Sorry, I muted myself. Dan Garber.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I think Sennert is actually a very fascinating character. When I teach a class on early modern philosophy, I like to begin with a bit of scholasticism, and his early 1618 work fits, which was translated in English, fits the bill as an almost classic early modern textbook Aristotelian natural philosophy. But I found the idea of a hylomorphic animism quite intriguing. You did talk about the relation to the minima naturalia tradition a little bit. That went by a little bit quickly for me. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What I'm wondering is, obviously he was different from many earlier versions of that, but couldn't his view be considered as a kind of version of a minima naturalia view?
Yes. I think I said that in the presentation. I'm not going to try to share the screen again. I don't want to create any confusion, but yes, his hylomorphic atoms are what we might consider minima naturalia. Yes, absolutely. And I did refer to them as such in the presentation and as being, in some sense, the lowest sort of ontological level. And then the prima mixta being the first level of complexity of compounded atoms. And then after that, much more complexity ensues from further compounding and so on. But yes, absolutely. The hylomorphic atoms are, for Sennert, a type of minima naturalia. Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next question, Gideon Manning.
Hi, thanks very much for that. So I have a question about, maybe I should frame it a little differently, but so there are two big names in the work of Sennert's that you cite. There's Aristotle and there's Galen, right? And one of the things that always strikes me about the discussions of Sennert is that everybody talks about Aristotle and scholasticism, but they never really talk about Galen and the experimental tradition that comes from medicine itself, right? That seems like a sort of self-standing tradition at that point. So the question I have is both to invite you to say something about Galen as background to both Sennert and Boyle. And the other or alternative framing I wanted to give you is the following, that in the case of Boyle, there are only two authors who figure as epigraphs in his published work more than once, Bacon and Galen. And the passage that's cited from Galen is a passage from the work on respiration, where Galen effectively says the following: we can't get to the essence of things, but that doesn't mean we can't do experiments and we can't proceed accordingly. And it always struck me that that's something that's sort of, in spite of Michael Hunter and many others who have, identified aspects of anti-Galenist sentiment in Boyle, there's a lot of Galen in Boyle. And I think the same is true of Sennert. Obviously, this is kind of a hobby horse of mine. So I wanted to see if you could fill in some of the gaps that might exist, if you can.
I'm not as familiar with Galen as you are, so I don't know if I can fill in those gaps. But in terms of, is your question in terms of getting at the essence of things more so?
Well, so it's more. So part of it is about the history of operationalism and experimentation and influences on Sennert. Part of it is about the robust tradition of medicine that Galen and his corpus represents. He's one of the two figures that Sennert mentions, but almost invariably, and I don't mean to cast aspersions, but people only talk about Sennert in connection to Aristotle. They almost never talk about him in connection to Galen. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, the reason why I focus myself on the connection to Aristotle and the scholastics has specifically to do with this issue, because I focus on his response to the scholastic view of substantial form. But if I were to venture an answer to your question, the idea that he attempts to provide empirical support for this sort of theoretical postulation of hylomorphic atoms as a kind of alternative hypothesis to the scholastic view of substantial form is probably, again, would probably be the influence of that experimental and tradition that comes from Galen. Because one of the things that I mentioned is that he seems to be, in the context of chemistry, even though, again, this experiment had been done before by other alchemists before him, he seems to be the first to actually bring theory and experiment together in this way and say, okay, here I have this hypothesis for how I can respond to the scholastic view of substantial form, which leads to these problematic conclusions about mixts. And here I have an empirical sort of experimental way of trying to lend support to that theoretical hypothesis. So, and that idea of marrying theory and experiment, of course, is indicative of how important, in some sense, you could say his thought is for the development of modern science, because that's what we have. So, as I said, if I were to venture an answer to your question, it would be to say that, at least in terms of what I'm discussing here today, the importance of Galen here, or of the whole experimental tradition, and would be in terms of not only formulating a hypothesis to respond to the scholastics, but also then using an experiment to lend empirical support for that hypothesis. But I don't know if I've satisfied or provided a satisfactory
Don't feel bad.
answer.
Nobody satisfies me on this issue, but I do think that there's illumination to be found in incorporating Galen and the medical tradition onto these very same questions. Not only do they have views about the minima of nature, but a host of other kinds of interventions, to say nothing of the chemical side of medical theory and practice.
I'd just like to add that Boyle has something like a pre-Lockean distinction between real and nominal essences that seems very close to what you were saying in that quote. So that could have been a Galen influence.
Apologies for intervening in this moment, but we have to move on to our next paper for tonight, not before thanking Marina for her talk.
Thank you.
Right, and the last in line, the next paper in our session, and the last paper in our session, is Boyle's Medical Recipes as Experiments Proving the Corpuscular Philosophy, Michele DiMeo. Michele, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. I have a double screen thing going on here. So let's see. All right, so you can see my PowerPoint. Okay, I'm gonna go here. Okay, and if you give me 1 second, I'm gonna try to pull up my paper on the other screen. Okay, can you still just see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we do.
Perfect, okay. So actually, I think some of the stuff I'll be discussing in my paper is going to address some of the questions that have taken place earlier today around Boyle and medicine and Galen. But this is a new project, so I very much welcome feedback on this. So I'm approaching this as a historian who's interested in whether or not we can consider recipes as experiments. And this is responding to some new research that's been taking place within the history of science and medicine more broadly. So I'll jump in. Over the last decade, advance this. Yep. Can you see this? Okay. All right, over the last decade, historians have revealed how early modern recipes were tested through trials and proved reliable through a process of empirical observation and the creation of reproducible effects. Such new research necessarily elevates the role of domestic practitioners, artisans, and tradesmen in the history of science, but it also raises new questions about some of the intellectual hierarchies that existed in the early modern period. In Elaine Leong's important book, Recipes and Everyday Knowledge, she notes, quote, while personal experience and direct observation stand at the center of the practices described here, our historical actors are reticent about contextualizing their undertakings within theoretical frameworks. After following with examples, she concludes, quote, even though these practices were occurring at the same time as the natural philosophical experiments conducted by members of the nascent Royal Society, they had different aims. I agree with Elaine Leong, and the subtle division between these two contemporary epistemological frameworks is what makes Robert Boyle's later medical writings worthy of closer analysis here. So while we all know that Boyle was a founding fellow of the Royal Society and a staunch advocate of the new experimental philosophy, he was also an avid recipe collector, and he maintained a lifelong interest in medicine. His vast collection of recipes numbered over 1,000, and he indiscriminately intermingled chemical compounds and metallic processes with herbal simples. In fact, when judged by the multiple number of editions, volumes, and supplements, Boyle's published recipe collection, seen here, Medicinal Experiments, was actually his second most popular text, and it failed only to outrank his early moralist work, Seraphic Love. As such, Boyle provides us today with a rare opportunity to explore how multiple forms of early modern natural inquiry converged with and departed from each other. By focusing on a few related medical texts that Boyle published in the final decade of his life, this is two decades after the stuff that we heard from Bill about the usefulness of natural philosophy. I'm going 2 decades later. I articulate that Boyle's view that both medical simples and specifics could be explained by the corpuscular philosophy. He thereby offers an alternative view of bodies, diseases, and medical efficacy that by using mechanical explanations to reconcile the opposing dominant theories offered by Helmontian and Galenical physicians. And before I go further, I will say I'm using Helmontian and Galenic as a shorthand that is used by Michael Hunter and others. I think we should break down some of these categories, and we can maybe talk more about that in discussion, because I will talk about how Galen differs from what the Galenic physicians said. But furthermore, I show that Boyle, while he held the opinion that medical recipes and experimental histories could be retrospectively situated within theoretical frameworks, not all practitioners can or should be regarded as philosophers. And Boyle does still articulate a hierarchy among chemists and clearly distinguishes himself and his peers apart from the vulgar chemists. He is equally critical of physicians who refuse to use medical recipes that have been proven effective. So the work on which I'll primarily focus today because of time constraints is the 1685 work of the reconcilableness of specific medicines to the corpuscular philosophy, to which is annexed a discourse about the advantages of the use of simple medicines. So by conflating these two works, this is itself significant, and it would immediately indicate to those looking at this book that Boyle is trying to use the corpuscular philosophy to bridge the gap between chemical and humoral understandings of the body. So specifics were born out of iatrochemical explanations of the body and disease, whereby the properties of an item or a substance could be used to treat a specific ailment in the body. Historian of medicine Hal Cook has shown elsewhere the ability to define a disease as a discrete entity that had universal qualities across all bodies resulted in many commercially available chemical specifics proliferating the market. The possible existence of these specifics ran counter to some of the prevailing Galenic theories, which defined disease as an imbalance of the humors and required a method of evacuation to rid the body of diseased materials and restore the body's natural state. Traditional medicine still advocated that bodies differed from each other based on humoral constitution, so a supposed medical specific was only suppressing the illness in the body and not curing it of the underlying problem. Galen had endorsed a practical pharmacology based on the use of simple drugs, and he included vegetables, minerals, and animals that could be used to treat a wide variety of ailments. He explained that the effects of simple remedies within a theory of the four qualities and classified them according to their nature, quality, heating, and cooling effects. But while the ingredient itself may be the same, the theory behind how a simple and a chemical specific worked were different. So simples could be used to treat a wide variety of ailments that fit within this larger classification system, but a specific worked because it had a particular quality that could treat a particular disease. So I will break this down further by talking about the Peruvian bark debate that took place at this time. The controversy between whether a drug worked as a specific or within a larger theory of simples is best explained by the debates surrounding this that were vibrant across early modern Europe in the second half of the 17th century. The Jesuit order established a regular, oh, it says participants can now see my screen. Do you see something different? Oh, it looks the same. Okay, sorry. I don't know why that popped up. The Jesuit order established a regular shipment of the bark from Peru to Rome during the 1640s and conducted trials that established it as effective against intermittent fevers. Also known as Jesuit's bark, cinchona bark, China bark, it contains quinine and it was used to treat malaria, a serious concern for settlers during this period of colonial exploration. Traditionally trained physicians, such as Jean-Jacques Chifflet, argued that the bark had no evacuant properties, and therefore it left the febrile matter within the patient's body. He referred back to ancient authorities who disapproved of quick empirical methods that did not actually cure the body by ridding it of the source of disease. Thomas Willis entered the conversation by proposing a possible iatrochemical explanation. He posited that fevers were caused by a heightened acid state of the body and that particles of the bark entered the blood and created a new fermentation that regulated it again. He also suggested that powdered Peruvian bark could be given in wine, which might help evacuate or suppress the morbific matter that had caused the fever. However, Willis remained hesitant to posit a wider pharmacological theory of specifics due to so few confirmed comparable examples in nature. He also presented his chemical explanation in a careful manner that almost translated Galen and some Galenic doctrine into corpuscular theories of matter. It was Thomas Sydenham who pushed the mechanical and chemical theories further by endorsing Peruvian bark as a specific that could be used to treat recurring fevers. However, he cautioned that it was the, quote, only true specific, and he endorsed it based on trials he had witnessed. He also advocated for extreme caution with dosage and was wary of its sudden market proliferation. French surgeon Nicolas Blenny responded with a counter-argument against the existence of specifics, suggesting that the Peruvian bark was actually a simple herb that could be used medicinally to treat a wide range of problems. He was also critical of Thomas Willis, whom he said was content to quote, understand and well observe the phenomena that depends thereon without troubling oneself with the efficient principles thereof. And I think actually just to stop and say that I think this is kind of what some of the discussion we had earlier about practice and being able to theorize your observations. I think that both the Galenists and the Helmontians or the chemical physicians were dealing with these kinds of questions. The French physician Antoine Joaquin, one of Blenny's patrons, offered a Galenic explanation of what they witnessed based on digestion. He called the bark very stomachal. Instead of treating the bark like a specific, he advocated for incorporating it into individualized treatment plans that included purges. So in addition, he also advocated his own compound remedy, which mixed the bark with opium. So to summarize on this, while most physicians agreed that the Peruvian bark was effective in their trials of witnessing this, they saw it treating recurring figures, but there was no agreement as to how it worked. As the example shows, some like Sydenham saw it as proof that a specific did exist and that this could be used to promote a wider theory of disease that treated all diseases as behaving similarly across all bodies. But others still held on to ancient theories of individualized bodies and argued that these new so-called specifics were actually examples of herbal simples that could be used in isolation or in combination with other materials to make compounds to evacuate diseased matter. Such treatments could be used for a variety of purposes and should be administered, in their view, only by medically trained professionals who had an understanding of the individual body constitution. These traditional physicians rejected the emerging theories of nosology that ran counter to the growing consumer medical marketplace that allowed patients to purchase or make specific drugs to treat specific symptoms and diseases. Trying to advance this slide and it doesn't want to, but maybe it will eventually. Oh, there we go. I think that worked. Okay. It is in this cultural context that Boyle began writing his medical tracts on specifics and simples across the 1680 and 81, and he would publish this work in 1685. As these titles suggest, he's trying to use the corpuscular philosophy to reconcile two prevailing but supposedly opposing belief systems that dominated the medical establishment at this time. Boyle begins his introduction here by explaining his own terminology. He acknowledges that physicians use the term specific to describe a medicine that works in three different ways. One that has a specific quality that makes it friendly to a particular part of the body. And two, one with a specific power to attract and evacuate a particular humor. And three, one that has the ability to cure a specific disease by some hidden property. Boyle says that the later definition is most commonly used by physicians, and so he's going to use that himself. However, he says he will not confine himself to this use of the term specific if the occasion requires him to consider the other two meanings. And after providing this definition, Boyle continues to respond to contemporary debates about specifics by cautioning that he does not think the remedy will always work in every situation and for every person, because such a remedy does not exist. He also argues that specifics do not work like charms, which are cured by a latent unknown quality that cannot be explained by contemporary frameworks for the body. Instead, a specific is a medicine that cures a patient or lessens their disease in most situations, and it works because it has qualities that are friendly to the manifest qualities affected by the illness. So upon explaining his use of the term specific, Boyle states that the purpose of this book is to answer two questions. The first is the very possibility that such a medicine like a specific could even exist. And the second is whether the mechanical hypothesis could be reconciled with its existence. The majority of the text is spent addressing the second question, but his response to the first question offers many informed answers to the prevailing debate that was taking place among academically trained physicians. He unequivocally defends the existence of specifics, and he uses many examples from both ancient and modern observation, as well as personal experience. In fact, Boyle's first example is Galen himself. Boyle asks his reader to remember the testimonies of Galen, that he had, for instance, advocated on the use of ashes derived from burnt crawfish to treat the bite of a mad dog. Galen acknowledged that this remedy was useful on its own, but that its virtue could be increased if combined with the plants of gentian and frankincense. Boyle also notes that centuries before Galen, the same remedy was recommended by the Greek physician Diacortes, who also endorsed burnt shellfish to treat the same ailment and offered two similar experiences that could be confirmed by ancient authorities. After giving several examples of ancients, he then continues with other examples of people being cured by specifics, including English settlers using a plant known as Virginia snakeweed to treat rattlesnake bites. But he even touches upon this famous Peruvian bark debate and notes that in private, Thomas Willis once told him, quote, "'Tis the noblest medicine we," meaning the physicians, know. So again, using both Galenic and Helmontian examples here to unite the argument around that's taking place right now. Upon strongly advocating that the existence of specific medicines is undeniable, Boyle moves on to discuss the second question, which is whether specific medicines could be reconciled with the mechanical philosophy. Boyle's theory suggests that specifics were composed of corpuscles, or tiny particles, that were friendly to a part of the body or disease. And as we heard in Marina's talk, since corpuscles differ from each other in terms of size, texture, and motion, some of them can be naturally attracted to or repelled by others. So for the remainder of the text, Boyle carefully articulates many possible explanations for a corpuscular theory of therapeutic specifics. And this directly counters many of the objections that he has heard against them. For example, some physicians argued that medicines could not possibly work by corpuscular means, since digestion must change the properties of the corpuscles once they pass through the stomach. Boyle responded by saying that external remedies, such as ointments, plasters, and poultices, avoided the stomach altogether and were therefore not changed by digestion. Instead, tiny particles seeped into the body through pores in the skin, and then the blood carried those, quote, magnetical corpuscles to others to which they were naturally attracted. For an oral remedy that must be ingested, Boyle pointed to other examples in nature where diverse bodies retain their nature in all the digestion and strainers that they pass through, suggesting to his reader that they could explore some of his other works. Boyle's mechanical explanation for therapeutic medicines relies on the analogy that the body is a living engine. And he explains, quote, "A living human body is not to be looked upon as a mere statue or a mere congeries of the materials 'tis composed of, flesh, blood, bones, fat, nerves, veins, arteries, etc., but is an admirably framed engine consisting of stable, liquid, and pneumatic substance." With this in mind, Boyle uses the remainder of this text to posit mechanical explanations for the variety of medical remedies that have been proven to work through repeated experiences and direct observation. The book reads like a cross between an experimental history and a medical recipe because it offers ingredients, virtues, and dosage information that would allow for reproducibility, but also he steps back to reflect on possible corpuscular explanations for their efficacy. The primary benefit of Boyle's theoretical explanation is that it offered a rationale for how specifics could cure disease without simply suppressing it in the body. He argued, quote, "Sometimes a specific remedy may unite its particles with those of the peccant matter and with them constitute a neutrum quid. Therefore, harsher evacuation methods such as purges and vomits would not be required. These specifics may be, quote, easily prescribed and cure and or relieve the patient, and it is usually attained without violence and without tormenting or much disordering him." So bound along with this book on specific medicines is a book-length appendix on specific medicines is this book-length appendix on simple medicines. And this work directly expands upon his theory of specifics by offering possible mechanical explanations for how simple remedies worked. So while physicians might use the term simples in a specific Galenic taxonomy, Boyle clarifies here how he's using the term is slightly different. For him, simple medicines were composed of 1 or 2 and a maximum of 3 ingredients, and they were used to treat a particular disease or ailment. He states that these are the opposite of, quote, pompous remedies that might comprise dozens of ingredients and proclaim to cure everything. Boyle also argued that he argued for simple medicines on experimental grounds. By limiting a recipe to a maximum of 3 ingredients, one could more easily analyze how these ingredients interacted with each other and with specific parts of the body or with specific types of diseases and ailments. Like his recommendation for using transparent vessels in chemical experiments, Boyle endorsed methods that would improve the experimenter's ability to observe how different parts of nature interacted with each other. By using these chemical mechanical theories of the body and corpuscular explanations for matter, this work offered several possible explanations for how and why various medical recipes worked, though he notes that it might also be a combination of the reasons that he offers, and it might also be explanations not yet known to man. Boyle said he followed the lead of Galen in complaining about these, quote, dogmatical physicians, whose practice was governed strictly by a theoretical framework that was not supported by the evidence presented in trials. Boyle himself worked in an opposite matter. He placed the emphasis on conducting trials and testing efficacy claims first. Then he applied a theoretical understanding for the usefulness he witnessed afterwards, the same as he did with his natural philosophy experiments. Peter Ansey and Rosemary Sargent have demonstrated Boyle's self-proclaimed, quote, backwardness with regards to theory. The establishing of a matter of fact or probability through observation must come first, and then a theory to explain that particular evidence must be may be postulated after. While the experimentalists generally rejected speculative philosophical systems as guiding principles or as a replacement for the experiment and observation, Boyle was more concerned with the right ordering of them all and making them serviceable to each other. Boyle's backwards method of applying the corpuscular philosophy to empirical medicine in these 2 related texts is important for many reasons. First, it offered a theoretical explanation to those physicians who were hesitant to use empirical medicines without understanding how they worked. Second, by using both Galenic and Helmontian examples throughout both texts, Boyle used the corpuscular philosophy to break down divisions between the 2 dominant branches of European medicine in the 1680s. While the corpuscular philosophy still clearly relied on a chemical mechanical understanding of the body, Boyle thoughtfully reconciled this new philosophy with ancient doctrine and with parts of traditional medicine that still appeared to be efficacious. While Boyle maintained great respect for the medical craft, he also regularly complained of the stubbornness and rigidity of academically trained physicians who would not use new methods unless that had been proven effective. These texts served as Boyle's careful and articulate attempt to advance medical discourse and practice. So Boyle followed this theoretical publication by printing a bunch of recipes meant for mostly a popular audience. Medicinal Experiments came out a few years later, and it consists of 100 simple and specific recipes, and it's printed as a cheap pocket-sized duodecimo and states that it was intended to be, quote, useful in families and very serviceable to country people. Boyle had adopted Francis Bacon's distinction between luciferous and fructiferous experiments, and the pairing of these different books for different audiences provides further evidence of Boyle's thoughtful rhetorical strategy here. A luciferous experiment could reveal the underlying cause of a phenomenon, while a fructiferous experiment would expose a practical or economic benefit that was of little or no use to the natural philosophy. Yet Boyle also cautioned against creating these 2 as polar opposites between experiments that yielded useful or theoretical gains, because it was likely that a philosophical truth had just not yet been discovered, and that the underlying cause for the properties or qualities of a useful effect had not yet been determined. Boyle's published recipe collection when it's an example of these practical experiments. But the addition of his theoretical work, the specific medicines, which he was composing at the same time, was his attempt to elevate these two luciferase experiments. And I can talk more, I don't have a ton of time now, but this was a privately published circulation of his recipes that came out a few years before the published edition that talks a little bit about his experimental practice with recipes. But in the preface to this privately circulated recipe book that was done before the public printed publication, he says, "I am willing that this short collection should furnish you with diverse instances to confirm the paper to which I desire you subjoin it of the usefulness of simple medicines." So again, this pairing between his recipes and his theoretical works. So to conclude, Boyle's 1680s medical texts are important to historians and philosophers today because they allow us to see how one experimentalist used practical domestic remedies to support developing theories of matter, and how such theories could in turn be used to promote wider use of therapeutics by household practitioners. And while the 1680 printing of Boyle's Skeptical Chemist specifically talks about distinguishing himself from vulgar chemists, these contemporary publications offer a more nuanced understanding of how Boyle used, theorized, and promoted the works of lay practitioners and his work with Galenic physicians of his day. So thank you. I will stop my screen share.
Thank you. We have some time for questions and comments. Who wants to begin? GP Asher, I saw a hand.
Yeah, thank you. This is a quick one, Michele. I love the talk and it's wonderful. And one of the things you just touched on at the end is Boyle's deliberate manipulation of rhetoric, right? Like he has projects, he's almost never quite doing what he says. And I just wondered if you could introduce us into your ways of cutting through that, right? Like, how do you know when it's Boyle being straight versus Boyle making you think what he wants you to think without being straight?
Oh, that's such a great question. And actually, I published about this elsewhere because I think if you look at things like his publication methods, so for instance, that one I showed of the simple medicines, his name is not on the title page of that, and it's 1688, which is very rare. And it's because he was using that and it's privately circulated. He prints it, he buys all of the copies of that book himself and circulates it amongst people. He gets the information back and edits it, and then a much more streamlined version of that gets published a few years later. So I think if we look at his use of the printing press, some of the differences between his different manuscripts, what he says in private versus what makes it into that final publication, I think is significant as well. And also, I think he does give a lot of clues to who his target audiences are in his works when he says, this one's meant for the service of country people, but then in his other one, he takes out a lot of those and he's specifically talking to physicians, and you could tell just by some of the language he uses that he's appealing to a different audience here. So I would say it's a combination of all of these factors that he's written so much, of course. So once you start to get to know the body of his work, you also get to understand his own writing style. Thank you.
Right. I did see Dolores with a hand up, I think. Dolores.
I think you're still muted, Dolores.
How to unmute?
There you are.
Oh, okay, great. So Michele, thank you so much. I just, as you know, I absolutely love your work. So, so I wondered how you can connect what you're talking about now with the stuff that Gianni Pomata has done on medical case studies, because and what Hal has talked about in terms of the availability of Peruvian bark, because markets opened up and then it became, as it were, a go-to remedy in Paris and Rome and Leiden and all of these different places. And part of what Boyle's motivation is for regular people to be able to get remedies. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about how what you're doing now relates to those two things.
Yeah, thank you so much, because that's where I want to take this next. I've mostly been kind of with blinders on trying to read this text and figure out what he says in relation to others, but that's the next step. I agree with you, is that what he's trying to do here is advocate that people should be able to buy their own medicines and that they should be able to try new remedies that have been proven true. And I think he's trying to slowly move the medical profession in that way, but he's very careful to do it in a way that is intellectually grounded and using the support both of the experimental method that he's using as well as his own work, specifically the work of others that they will relate to, like using Galen in a way that they can look at this and understand it, and maybe that's something that's familiar to them, so they can appreciate the Peruvian bark in a new way because they have an ancient theory for how one can use it. So I think that's where I'd like to take this, is push a bit further, because especially if we look at Michael Hunter's work on Boyle versus the Galenists, he talks a lot about those suppressed manuscript writings that Boyle was very angrily composing and chose not to publish. But just a couple of years later, he publishes this work, and again has a separate stream. Some of them go for the country people and are serviceable, and then there's this theoretical component that kind of supports it for these audiences that might be skeptical. Does that answer the question?
So one of the things that you could do is talk about Boyle's work on Peruvian bark as one of the products of fruit of the New Atlantis, because I think that because it fits perfectly into the narrative that especially with the work of Monardes on the Peruvian bark. So it's coming from an indigenous source. It's yeah, and it's marketable, it's available, it's cheap. Not cheap, but it's the only other thing that I would add is that there's a question about how pure the Peruvian bark is, and what the apothecaries are selling as Peruvian bark, and how much of it is cut, cocaine, so you don't really know that you have the pure thing. Right. So does Boyle ever talk about how you can test whether Peruvian bark has a high materia medica value?
That's a good question that I have to look back at. In these works, I've seen him say that it's true that when this experiment is done in various places, you do not always get the same effect. And he does say that it could be that the quality of the ingredient is not as strong as another, but it might be worth looking further into what you're describing in terms of if he does any analysis of the purity of the ingredients themselves or the market from which you purchase them. Of course, this is happening while the apothecaries are trying to argue for more rights and not having to go to a physician. So there's a lot happening in the wider marketplace as well.
Right. And then you have to look at the middleman to see why is it that Peruvian bark is being taken away from the control of the Jesuits, and and how much is the middleman taking, and that kind of thing. So there's that Hal Cook kind of cultural markets angle on it as well.
I had thank you. I had a talk with Hal about this a couple of years ago, but I have to reach back out. So you're encouraging me to forward this. So thank you.
Joe has a question.
Actually, I had two questions, but I know the time is very close to finishing. My short question is, did you have the impression that he actually tried these recipes out? Because, did he just copy paste some of the,
Oh, no, definitely didn't. Some of them are tested on himself, but many are tested by others. And he explains in another work his very meticulous testing system that includes, crosses and marks and numbers and annotations. And he goes through all of that before it makes it into the final book. So he's very rigorously testing them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that. And my other question was, more speculative, because I mean, you gave that quote, that strange quote about the human body not being congeries of things, but then he says it's an engine. I mean, for us today, we would think like the engine would be a congery in some way. So he kind of puts them opposite. So I don't know what that says about his view of mechanics, so of engines in some way.
He talks a lot about it being a living engine, though, and that matter itself and that the atoms are in movement, and so it's just not a static body is, I think, part of his theory behind this. And Marina, I don't know if you want to elaborate. I know you've done a lot of work on this in terms of the corpuscular philosophy and the view of bodies, but it's maybe something I can look more into, Joe, is to kind of expand that a little bit further and how that works in a theory of medicine too.
Thank you.
We are kind of approaching the end very quickly, but just in case there are more general questions or questions addressing earlier talks, maybe now it's the moment if anyone has.
I'd like to know
say.
what Daniel Garber has, what he thinks of Descartes' weird eel heart resurrection experiment.
His weird what?
He tries to resurrect the heart of an eel.
I didn't realize that. Where do you find that?
In that letter to Plempius in about I want to say 1638, I could be wrong. But yeah, he pours warm eel blood over an eel heart, and he says it starts beating. And he says that empirically confirms his view. And I've just always wondered what your thoughts on that weird experiment was. I'm thinking about replicating it. I can't hardly justify it, but I've got a sushi chef that can get a live eel and do it. But it's
Please
sort of
tell
cruelty
me.
to animals, and I know it doesn't work. So yeah, I don't know.
Please tell me what happens when you try it.
I'm going to bribe him with a bottle of scotch, and because it's such a weird request, and try and get him to do it.
If you could send me a reference,
I shall.
The passage, I'll look it up and tell you what it is that I think when I read it, but I must admit I never noticed that.
Well, it just seems like a counterexample to your theory of how experiment works in Descartes' philosophy. So yeah, I will. Thank you so much.
Well, I cannot restrain myself on this note to ask a question to Michele. What does Boyle mean by living machines? Or maybe to all the participants of the session, I don't know.
Yes, I would have to unpack, that would take me a while to unpack. I know Barbara Kaplan's done some work on this, actually, breaking down the theory of living machines. But I would definitely have to get more up to speed on that. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
He calls the human body a curious engine again and again. So it's a metaphor he's really fond of, and he just thinks it's, it's divinely more complex than any human machine.
Can I comment that the Leibniz talks about living machines, divine machines. It's very fundamental to his view of the whole world. The universe is a living machine, and then made up of living machines all the way down.
That's absolutely true, but it goes back in a certain way to Descartes and Le Monde, and the and the Traité de l'Homme, and the conception of the human being that you get there.
Yeah, I think it's earlier in Leibniz, isn't it?
No, it's actually earlier in Descartes, I think.
Well, he does, but I think Leibniz version is better.
Well, Leibniz version is a development of Descartes. I mean, the difference is, for Descartes, the machines are finite. For Leibniz, the machines are of infinite complexity. That's the
yeah, but Leibniz machines also are represented within dynamics, whereas Descartes is still stuck in, a classical mechanical framework ultimately.
Well, Leibniz considers that consistent, the dynamics consistent with the mechanical framework.
Well, mechanics is a part of dynamics, but dynamics is more general. Anyway.
But I wonder what the Boyle in this discussion is. I mean, where
Excuse
does
me,
Boyle
Mother.
stand in this discussion? Because
Well,
in
he
Boyle,
thinks,
it's not just a question of complexity, is it?
Well, that's a good point. But he thinks the microscope just continues to confirm these little micro mechanisms in living organisms that he sees as further evidence of God's, design. But what's the difference between that and like a crystal that is, not alive but can self-replicate? That's a great question.
Right, but it's
Can I make one
kind of,
last comment to the?
if it's short.
The middle thing, there's a book out, there's a new book out. I can't remember her last name now. It's Chiara Marletto, I think. And it's the physics of can and can't. And I think that relates to this negative evidence argument. I think it's new hot thing. Chiara Marletto. I was going to look it up here. But it's a new sort of theory of quantum mechanics. But it's all about that. It's the idea that science is really about what you can do and what you can't do, and those are two sides of the same coin. I think that's very close to what she was talking about earlier.
Can you repeat the last name or spell it out?
Well, I have to look it up because I don't have it right in front of me.
Okay.
Hang on just a second. I'll do it.
It is similar to that concept of an operational definition.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hang on, I got it here. If you YouTube her, well, you can do that. You have to know the name, don't you?
Yeah,
Google her.
Looking through my.
well, maybe this can be a nice subject for an email later on.
Yeah.
Because,
okay. Yeah.
Because that we are kind of going over
Marletto.
time.
Chiara Marletto. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Okay,
So join me in thanking everyone, the speakers that we had tonight for wonderful papers. And next week, we are going to talk about theories of mental representations in early modern philosophy. The experiment tonight worked, so until next week.
I can tell you what it is now because I looked it up. It's called, her book's called The Science of Can and Can't. And her name is Chiara, Chiara, and it's Marletto, Marletto.
Excellent. Thank you.
Right. And bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye. Thank you.